Under the new rules on e-petitions, any cause which attracts 100,000 signatures can be considered for a parliamentary debate. It is the people setting the agenda. This is Robert Halfon, the Tory MP, speaking in a Commons debate triggered by public antipathy about rising fuel duties.
We must show that tax cutting is a moral creed. We must show that this is a government not for the many, for not the few. A government that cuts taxes for the millions of British people, not just for millionaires.
So far, petitions have triggered some of the most electrifying Commons debates in recent years, including ones on the Hillsborough tragedy and calls for a European referendum. But some politicians are getting nervous about the trend. I talked to Robert Halfon, champion of the fuel protesters, and Natasha Engel, the Labour chair of the Commons Backbench Business Committee, which chooses subjects for debate. And I started by asking Natasha Engel if e-petitions were not the best thing to have happened at Westminster for years.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really livened things up. I mean, I absolutely wouldn't deny that. It's kind of breathed a new life into Parliament. But I just think that unless we're careful in the way that we deal with it, we're in danger of actually sort of raising people's expectations falsely and then not being able to meet those. My real worry is that unless we really deliver on what it is people perceive that we've promised them, then actually they're going to be very disappointed and walk away from something where we've actually got a possibility of really engaging people.
Robert Halfon, you introduced the motion this week on fuel prices, stopping the increase in January on fuel prices. Do you think people are let down by this? I mean, it seemed to me to be a fairly effective piece of parliamentary democracy in action.
Yes, I think it worked very well. And actually, I think democracy is slowly changing in this country. We're moving away from mainframe type democracy to open source democracy where people can have a real say. And I'm a passionate believer in direct democracy, in referendums and petitions.
Do you think your debate this week will make a difference? Has it forced the government to think again on fuel duty?
Well, I hope so. I mean, we had a motion that was signed by 116 MPs from all parties, and it was passed unanimously and created a huge amount of press interest. I hope very much the government will listen. All one can do as a backbench MP is make a noise about things and campaign for things, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the indications are that the government is listening to this.
Well, Natasha, why do you think people might feel that they're not getting what they thought they were signing up to with the e-petition?
I think what's happened is that there's a difference between what the government has promised and what people perceive the government to have promised. So the government, all they've said is that when a petition reaches 100,000 signatures, that triggers a letter from the Leader of the House to the Chair of the Backbench Business Committee to tell them that 100,000 signatures has been reached and could we please consider it for debate. It does not, which is what I think the public perception is, trigger a debate, a vote and a change in the law. And I think also people aren't that interested in the detail. They're saying, you've said that 100,000 signatures means that something happens. This is what we want to happen. And there isn't really that much of engagement going on. It's really kind of people demanding from us rather than us actually having a proper conversation about how Parliament works in order to show people how to influence it better. So I think it's all become very one-sided.
If it is a good idea, the e-petition system, why do we hear reports that the government's considering raising the threshold for the number of signatures needed to trigger a debate, or at least the consideration of a debate, from 100,000 to 150,000?
I'm pretty confident that the government never suggested that. I think that's a piece of kite flying. I mean, all the people that I've spoken to within government understand that the threshold cannot be raised. I mean, there would be, quite rightly, complete public outrage if that happened. Imagine if your e-petition was just about to reach 100,000 signatures and, oh, no, we're going to move the goalpost. I mean, people would be very angry about that. But I think what we could do and what would be sensible at looking at is to remove the threshold altogether. I think that 100,000 trigger is meaningless. It's a completely plucked out of the air number. And I went up to Scotland last week to have a look at how they deal with e-petitions, just to see whether there's something that we could learn. And in fact, they don't have a threshold. What they have is a dedicated select committee that looks at all public petitions, including paper petitions. As we had the EU referendum debate, in fact, was generated by a paper petition, not an e-petition. So what you would do if you wanted to raise a petition is you would submit it to a dedicated unit, And at that point, your expectations would be managed. They would tell you what you could do and what you can't do. And they bring in the petitioners themselves to kind of make representation to the Public Petitions Committee. That's a much better way of doing things.
Robert Halfon, do you agree that this open source democracy needs a bit more management at Westminster?
Yes, it certainly needs more management. But where I would disagree with what Natasha said, I do think there should be a threshold. I think 100,000 is reasonable because it shows the strength of opinion and it gives a target to meet. And it was immensely satisfying when I organised the fuel e-petition with Fair Fuel UK. It took 6 weeks to get it, but we felt we'd actually achieved something. And I think that's very important to give people goals.
Can I just raise one other question with you? Does the e-petition movement and the fact that we're having more debates like yours on the floor of the House, in a way, legitimise revolt, rebellions, if you like, by government MPs? The new intake certainly seems to be more rebellious than previous new intakes. Has it sort of added to the sense that backbenchers are trying to reclaim Parliament?
Well, I think that the new intake, many, particularly on the Conservative side, so many of us have been campaigning MPs and having to fight 2 or 3 elections, as I did. And I think they're much more in touch with constituency and grassroots than necessarily happened in the past.
It must drive the party whips mad, mustn't it?
Well, they brought in, to their credit, the petition system and set up the backbench committee, which Natasha runs brilliantly. So inevitably, perhaps they didn't realise quite the course it would take, but it is a good thing for our democracy that these things are debated and that people feel they have a real sense of involvement.
Robert Halfon and Natasha Engel on People Power in the Commons.